Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we're taking a look at a game that Garry Kasparov played back in 1981. He wasn't quite the world champion yet, as Karpov had the crown at this stage, and he's playing the white side of the King's Indian actually. Kasparov was always known for his creativity on the black side of the King's Indian. So let's see how he handles the white pieces. He starts with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop to g7, e4, d6, knight f3, castles, bishop to e2, and e5. So we went through that sequence very quickly. It's just the standard King's Indian sequence that everybody has seen thousands and thousands of times. And in this position here, Kasparov plays bishop to e3. So this move here is called the Gligorich system. Black plays queen to e7. And now he's actually threatening a very typical tactic that we see in the King's Indian from the black side. If white were to waste the move here with a3, black can grab this pawn actually. And after white retakes, black takes on e5, and he is recollecting a piece, as in this position here, the knight is hanging and the bishop is hanging as well. So that is why in this position here, we see white play d5. That stops black's threat. And now I see knight to g4. This is one of the annoying ideas that black has in the Gligorich system. The bishop on e3 can be harassed by this knight. And usually in other lines of the King's Indian defense, the bishop often lands on d2, actually, where it's quite useful to support the queenside activity and the expansion that white has on that side of the board. But there are other ideas that the dark square bishop has in the Gligorich system. We have bishop to g5, hitting the queen, f6, and the bishop drops back to h4. And in this position here, black plays an interesting move, h5, which actually comes with a bit of hidden venom, should we say. In this position, black has the hidden but devious threat of potentially pushing forward with g5, hitting the bishop. And then if the bishop drops back to g3, he'll push forward with h4, and that bishop would be trapped. It might look like a bit of an innocent move here to guard his knight, but actually there's a devious threat that black has in this position. So Kasparov plays knight to d2, and his idea is that if black tries to pursue that bishop, actually anytime he plays h4, he's actually hanging his knight, so we'd be able to scoop up that knight in that sequence. So black doesn't go for that. Instead, he plays c5, and in this position here, Kasparov plays d takes c6 en passant, and after the recapture, we see a pawn structure that isn't the most common in the King's Indian. So let's see how white handles this. Kasparov plays b4. He is getting his queenside activity rolling, and his idea is that eventually he might be looking to play b5 to undermine this pawn here on c6. And we can see that if that pawn were suddenly to disappear, black would be left with this absolutely gaping hole on d5. And if a white knight manages to stay there long term, it would be absolutely crippling for black. So that is the strategic direction for white in this game. We have bishop to e6 from black, looking to guard those central light squares. And here it's important for white not to rush matters by playing b5 immediately. It's a double-edged move that needs to be considered quite carefully. Let's say we take on c6, looking to take advantage of that d5 hole for our knight. Actually, black would be recapturing c6 with his knight, and he's quickly finding himself with a glorious outpost knight. So that would be quite a double-edged sequence that white would need to calculate very carefully. So instead of that, Kasparov plays castles, and we see knight to d7. So black's idea with this move, knight to d7, is that if white were to rush things with the immediate b5, he's actually giving up the c5 square. And so black's question here is, well, okay, mister, if you want to play b5, you'll be allowing me to play knight c5. Do you really want me to have this glorious outpost for my knight? So of course Kasparov doesn't immediately play b5. Instead, he routes his knight to b3, which covers c5. So in the case of b5, knight c5, we can simply snap that knight off. Not only that, notice that this move, knight to b3, now means that the queen is suddenly very active, and she's tickling that point on d6, which is quite tender. At the moment, it's only being guarded by black's queen. And now we have this really interesting move from black. Knight takes h2. What is his idea here? So if we go back to this position here, remember that idea of g5 and h4 to trap that dark squared bishop. The issue with that sequence for black was that anytime we play h4, our knight is left hanging. So black here is saying to himself, well, I just don't want that to be an issue anymore. I don't want my knight to be hanging. So I'm going to destroy your king's position, and I'm going to be playing g5 and h4 and trap your bishop. A very, very interesting idea here from black. Let's see how Kasparov navigates this. So Kasparov takes the knight. We have g5 from black, and now we see the point of his sacrifice. There is definitely no saving that bishop. And now we have this completely unexpected and shocking and incredibly powerful move from Kasparov. Knight to a5, double exclamation mark. This would have come as a complete and unexpected shock to black, as it reinforces an important concept for club players actually. Oftentimes, the best thing that we can do when our opponent threatens us is to completely ignore that threat. Kasparov's idea in this position is that the knight is threatening to come into c6, but it's not just about taking that pawn. On c6, the knight would be hitting the queen, and we can see that if the knight is hitting that queen, the queen is also guarding d6, and she has nowhere to go that would continue to maintain a defensive contact. If the queen is forced to move from that square, white would be crashing through, would be collecting d6, and the entire black position would just fall apart. So it is an absolutely incredible move here. Knight to a5. Black plays knight to b8. He is desperate to prevent that continuation. He is looking to guard c6 however he can. But have a look at the sad state of affairs with his pieces now. Unbelievable. Kasparov plays bishop to g3. He is definitely not saving his piece here, but he does have some ideas in mind. So black plays h4. He must to recollect his piece. And now we see the point of Kasparov's moves. He plays bishop to g4, looking to exchange off black's most powerful minor piece. If we have a look at the situation of the pawns in the center of the board, we can see that white has his central pawns on light squares, which limits the scope of the light square bishop. Black's light square bishop, on the other hand, is incredibly important. We can see that the majority of black's pawns are on dark squares, which means the pieces have to control the light squares. And that means the light squared bishop for black is by far his most important piece. If we imagine that these light square bishops were to suddenly be removed from the board, black suddenly has some real gaping issues with his position. f5 would be terminally weak. c6 is very tender as well, which can easily be pressured. So some very strong strategic play here from Kasparov, looking to exchange these light squared bishops. And the unfortunate thing for black is that there's nothing he can do to actually avoid this. Let's say, for example, he tries to drop his bishop back to f7. We simply storm forward with our idea, b5, and if black takes on b5, we don't simply recapture it. No, we are landing our knight on d5, we are hitting the queen. Have a look at this absolutely glorious piece, and notice that black can't even take that knight to remove it because the queen would recapture and we'd be forking the king and the rook in the corner. So this would be a completely helpless position actually for black. So that is why, if we go back to this position here, black decided to actually exchange the bishops because he's got nothing better to do actually. Kasparov retakes, and in this position here, there's a number of different recaptures that we can make actually. We can take the pawn with our queen. We can even take with the king, looking to keep our queen on the light squares, or we can take with the f-pawn. So Kasparov decides that actually taking with the f-pawn is the strongest continuation because he has now brought his rook into the game, and we all know that Kasparov is all about piece activity. It might look a bit sketchy at first, seeing that white king there, but if at any time one of the black heavy pieces were to land on the h-file, the king can simply just shuffle back to g1 and there just aren't really any practical ways for black to take advantage of this diagonal. Okay, and so in this position, black plays a6, is desperately looking to prevent white from playing b5 and completely dominating the light squares. And now Kasparov plays this incredibly powerful knight to d1, and I'm sure at this point, this is when black really realized the helpless and dangerous situation that he is in now. The knight is coming to f5 via e3, and there's just nothing that black can do to prevent that. From f5, we'd be hitting the queen, we'd be hitting d6, we'd easily be able to pile up on d6 as well. So if that knight lands on f5, it's pretty much a strategically lost position for black. So in this position here, black decides to just lash out. He plays d5, looking to blow things open and liquefy things in the center of the board. And I think that this is a good practical lesson for club players, that when you see yourself in a situation where you're being slowly, strategically suffocated by your opponent, rather than just, turtling up and letting your opponent just strategically dominate, often it's better even to sacrifice a bit of material to open up lines, create some counterplay, and create some complications on the board. And so with this idea here, pushing the pawn forward to d5, notice now that the queen has now been opened up. We are hitting the b4 point, which is loose, which would also come with pressure against the knight on a5. And not only that, black isn't necessarily looking to take any of these pawns. He might actually just push forward himself and create himself a protected passed pawn. So a very good practical try here from black. And of course, Kasparov being Kasparov, he does what he normally does. Knight to e3, completely ignoring all of black's threats. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, well, didn't Kasparov just hang a pawn here? And doesn't that come with extra tempo against the knight? So in the game, black played rook to a7, but let's just ask the question, what happens if black takes that pawn on b4? This is an absolutely incredible sequence. We play rook to b1 here, double exclamation mark. Black takes the knight. We come in with our queen. The king shuffles to h7, and now we take control of the 7th rank with our rook. We are down a piece as white, but can you imagine? Look at the engine evaluation. The top two engine moves in this position are queen to b4 and queen to b6, which just completely hangs the queen to the rook. So when the engine is saying that the top two best moves in your position are to just give away your queen with no compensation, you know that the position is bad. And so why is it so bad? There are two completely devastating threats here in this position. First of all, the white rook can very easily find itself on that h file, where that would just be completely devastating for black. But second of all, the knight once again is coming into f5, would be pressuring g7, and it just turns out that there's no real practical way to guard that bishop. It's pinned at the moment. We'll very easily be able to add a third attacker with the queen on that point, and white is basically just crashing through and checkmating black, and there's nothing that can be done here. So that is why, if we go back to this position here, after Kasparov has just played his knight to e3, black actually played rook to a7. He saw the danger of the rook landing on the 7th rank, and his idea is, okay, now as black I might be threatening to take that pawn on b4 because my rook guards the 7th rank. Okay, so what does Kasparov do in this position? He takes that central pawn on d5, and black sees his opportunity to get active with the queen. He has picked up the pawn on b4 and he's attacking the knight on a5 as well. He plays queen to e6 check. Black intercepts with his rook, and he brings his knight back to c4. So notice back in this position here, the queen was threatening the knight on a5, but also the queen was threatening e4 as well. So Kasparov brings his knight back to c4, and he guards both of those threats, as the knight here is blocking the queen's access to e4. So black brings his queen back to e7, looking to potentially exchange off some pieces, but Kasparov sinks his knight into f5, and in this position actually black resigned. I just don't see any move that black can do here. What can he possibly try? Let's say, for example, he tries to exchange the queens, well, we simply retake. We're hitting the rook. Where is your rook going to go? Let's say, for example, you go to c7, looking to get some activity with your c-pawn and start potentially pushing your pawn forward. Well, we jump into d6, and that pawn is actually just marching forward. There's really kind of nothing that black can do to prevent this pawn from storming up the board. I don't even see how he can sacrifice an exchange, to be honest, because let's say, for example, I don't know, we're just shuffling our rook back and forth. We just push forward, and you can't even sacrifice the exchange because all of the escape squares for the rook are guarded by the knight. So you'd be just straight out losing a rook here. So black can't take the queen. So if you can't take the queen, then what else is happening here? Let's say you try to move the queen back to e8. We'd be coming in with our knight, forking the queen and the rook, and the queen would basically be forced to exchange, and we're back in that same variation that we just had a look at. So really nothing that black can do here. And so after knight f5, black just simply resigned. What a super interesting game that Kasparov played here, completely dismantling the King's Indian defense. His pet opening, dismantling it from the white side. Okay, thanks everyone for watching today's video.